to have the civil war that's going on at the moment. And if we look at the absolute monarchy in North Korea, which is on its third generation of what is effectively a hereditary monarchy, again, I don't think the people there are doing that well. And actually, the monarch being all powerful, appointing all the judges, all of these different things, running the government. And initially, the barons, the warlords, as I like to describe them, because it in a sense describes more accurately within today's discussions, come along and they say this isn't good enough. And it's rescinded about a year later, because the then equivalent of the EU is the Pope. Didn't like it because of its effect on the monarchy, because it was controlling the way in which the monarchy operated. There was then a war. Well, that's not surprising, because you have this tension between the warlords. And the original Magna Carta wasn't about the ordinary person in the street, or even the ordinary man in the street. It was about the barons and protecting their interests. And so there's another one then comes up in 1216 under Henry III. And that calms things down a little bit. But in a sense, it sort of didn't become, well, in a practical sense, it didn't become statute law till 1297. And I asked a question of the Prime Minister in 2012, in fact, where I said, if I can find it in here, I tried to put all the various useful bits of material around. I said, do the government's proposals on judicial review conflict with Article 29 of Magna Carta 1297? Do the government propose the repeal of Magna Carta? Now, a lot of people say, well, that isn't Magna Carta 1215, but actually, the one that's passed into law is in fact 1297. And if you look on the internet, and obviously this is going out on the internet, there is a website called legislation.gov.uk, and you can find Magna Carta 1297 there. And it's a little bit of a sad document, because you remember it's one of these documents which said this can never be changed. And of course it was changed. And we only now have 3 clauses left. One is confirmation of liberties. I might as well read it. First, we have granted to God, and by this our present charter have confirmed, for us and our heirs forever, that the Church of England shall be free, shall have her whole rights and liberties inviolable. We have granted also and given to all freemen of the realm, that's men again, for us and our heirs forever, these liberties underwritten to have and to hold them and their heirs of us and our heirs forever. That's the number 1. Number 9 is the City of London shall have all the old liberties and customs which it used to have. Moreover, we will then grant that all the cities, boroughs, towns, and the barons of the 5 ports and all other ports shall have their liberties and free customs. And the 5 ports, of course, were Hastings, New Romney, Hyde, Dover, and Sandwich. And then 29 is no freeman shall be taken or imprisoned, or be decised of his freehold or liberties or free customs, or be outlawed or exiled or any otherwise destroyed, nor will we pass on him nor condemn him, but by lawful judgment of his peers, or by the law of the land. We will sail to no man, we will not deny to defer to any man either justice or right. And in a sense, the number 29 is actually still very relevant today, because you have this question of justice. To what extent are we undermining access to justice? To what extent are the rules on costs with legal actions actually make it very difficult for people in the middle ground to take legal action? Wealthy people can take action because they can afford to lose. People on the legal aid can afford to take action. If you are on a very low income, you don't have to pay court fees and things like that. But at the same time, people in the middle ground can't take the risk, because the danger is that if you lose, the costs are so great. So the issue of access to justice, which is what 29 is really about, I wouldn't say is necessarily fully resolved today. The parliamentary website actually does a good list, which I won't read out from all of them, but does a good list of all the changes that went on from 1215. Obviously, back in 1258, when Simon de Montfort was powerful, he sort of started developing Parliament, the concept of Parliament that you have in the warlords, you have the commoners representing essentially wealthy people, and you have the monarch, and all 3 have to agree for laws to change. And obviously the monarchs weren't very pleased with this, and wars ensued from time to time over these issues. But generally as it says on here, as the king needed money, he called the barons to Parliament more frequently than ever before. In return for giving taxes, the barons asked for reforms in government in return. In particular, they wanted to be able to choose the king's ministers for him, and they wanted him to follow their advice, which he did not do. But actually, if we move forward to today, the equivalent really to the monarch is David Cameron, because he is the head of the executive of government. And we still have that same constitutional tension between the executive and the legislature. The big difficulty, of course, is that the king, in this instance, has a majority in the legislature. So the legislature is less independent than, say, in America, where they have a separately elected president, so that the Senate and the House of Representatives are more independent of the government. But the thing is, de Montfort's rules effectively were then implemented after that, even though he ended up dying as a result. And in a sense, the history of this is a lot of people suffer for fighting for liberty as they go along, although you perhaps could argue he was fighting for his own self-interest as well. But his scheme was adopted by Edward I at the Model Parliament of 1295, and that's where it then developed the Commons and the House of Lords. And for those who don't know, the Commons is green and the House of Lords red, because red dye is more expensive than green dye. And that was to emphasise the importance of the warlords, the barons, compared to everybody else. Although the Commons didn't meet separately from the Upper House until 1341, and it wasn't until 1362 that a law was passed saying Parliament should approve of all taxation. So things moved on, and we're still having these tensions developing, that the tension of trying to get control over power, the powerful, the monarch, the crown, the executive, and a lot of the changes, right, recording the parliamentary officials, unsurprisingly, find quite important that they are independent of government, and that's actually since 1497, when the clerk of the parliament became not an official of government, but actually an official of the house. And we have what's called house officers, who are officials of the house. So very often the people you see sitting in front of the speaker, amongst others. And they are, although they're on civil service scales, they're not employed as part of the civil service. They're employed independently to try and create that independence. 1523 was the first request that's known in history for freedom of speech in Parliament. That is the ability to criticise. Well, actually, at the moment, there's difficulties criticising the monarchy anyway. There's an interesting point about that, and I'm very happy later on. If you want to ask questions as I'm going along, very happy to answer questions as I go along. In 1576, Peter Wentworth made a speech in the Commons arguing for freedom of speech in Parliament, for which he was punished and committed to the Tower of London. So we sort of amble on merrily through the years, and in a sense, one of the interesting things, obviously we had the Civil War. One of the interesting things about the UK is we actually haven't had a revolution since 1688. Right? The constitutional settlement created in 1688 with the Glorious Revolution, which was a revolution, because not only did it change the monarch, but also Parliament created itself. It wasn't a continuation of the previous Parliament. And we had then the Bill of Rights, 1688, some people say 1689, just to deal with that particular point of what is the date of the Bill of Rights. It's a very interesting little point, which is that until, I think, 1752, and I have written it down in here, because I've got the Bill of Rights text, but at the end of it, I think I've got the reasons for it. And yes, until the 1st of January 1752, the calendar year began on March the 25th, rather than on the 1st of January. So, although the Bill of Rights, if you go back in years, was actually originally tabled in the Convention Parliament, which was on the 13th of February 1689, in fact, using the dates that they used at the time, it was the 13th of February 1688, because it wasn't until the 25th of March that it turned to 1689. And it was then signed into law later that year, in December that year. And one of the very, very important points in that is actually Article 13, which is about freedom of speech in Parliament. And obviously that is something that people had fought before over a number of occasions, and effectively it means that the courts cannot control what goes in Parliament. It's not, when people talk about privilege in terms of qualified privilege and absolute privilege with words spoken, obviously we have a number of constraints on freedom of speech. We have copyright, and everyone who followed the debate on Twitter recently, they will see that copyright is being used to get people's tweets off Twitter because they're somebody else's joke. So unless there was a lady who complained that her jokes were being retweeted without actually being acknowledged as her jokes, and so she managed under US law to get Twitter to take that down. And people talk about the US having freedom of speech. All freedom of speech is in fact qualified. Then we have qualified privilege. You can report something to the police as long as it's not done without malice and can't be sued for defamation. Absolute privilege, reports of court proceedings at the time. And then you have parliamentary proceedings which cannot be considered by the courts. And that came in with the Bill of Rights in 1688. Very important. There's a number of important clauses to it, to me. One is the clause 5, which is the right to petition the state to complain about things without being imprisoned. We forgot that one a little bit recently, but that's another matter. And then clause 13, which is that Parliament should meet regularly for the redress of all grievances. It gives that function of Parliament as being acting on behalf of the ordinary citizen. And although they were called subjects at that time, Parliament was a lot more robust. And if anyone's really interested in looking at this, we don't have a codified constitution. People say we don't have a written constitution. Well, actually, we don't have it all written in a book called the Constitution. And there's some other aspects to do with the Constitution I'll come to later. But what we do have is you can find bits of it, and some of the bits are stuck in the House of Commons library. And although those have been scanned and can be looked at on the internet, in fact, if you look on my blog, I photographed some of these things, and you can see examples of Parliament fighting to make sure that citizens were protected against abuse of power by the representatives of the King. I put those in about 2011, and if anyone emails me, I'll give them links through to the relevant documents. So, you know, we have, in a sense, we have the starting constitutional document of Magna Carta in 1297, and then we have the Bill of Rights in 1688, which, if anything, is actually the basic constitutional law of the country, because it was the founding document for the creation of the current sequence of Parliament. And there's a group of people they call themselves freemen of the land, and they try to argue a completely different thesis as to our constitutional structure based on the 1215 Magna Carta. And the reality of life is very simple. We established a new constitutional settlement in 1688, and if you're going to use legal arguments to derive things from that, then you have to start with what the constitutional settlement was in 1688, not in what it was in 1215, 1216, 1217 or 1297. And at that point, the Magna Carta and the status it was in fact the 1297 statute version of the Magna Carta. So that's an interesting point. And one of our difficulties as a country in not having a codified constitution is not only is it relatively difficult to work out what the constitution actually is, but also it's difficult to work out how to change it at times, and there's a lot of uncertainty about how to change it. And there are issues about, which statutes are our constitution? Two are very obvious, the Magna Carta and the Bill of Rights. There was a parliamentary joint committee on the draft Civil Contingencies Bill back in November 2003 that said that fundamental parts of constitutional law could be taken to include the following statutes. And I'll name ones apart from 6 other ones beyond the first two I mentioned. Crown and Parliament Recognition Act 1689, Union with Ireland Act 1800, Parliament Acts 1911 and 49, Life Peerages Act 1958, Emergency Powers Act 1964, House of Commons Disqualification Act 1975, Ministerial and Salaries Act 1975, British Nationality Act 1981, Supreme Court Act, now the Senior Courts Act 1981, Representation of the People Act 1983, Northern Ireland Act 1998, House of Lords Act 1999, Civil Contingencies Act 2004. And there's lots of different bits of legislation that have all had aspects of influence on how power is controlled, how laws are brought in. Key ones, however, of course, are the Act of Settlement 1700 and Act of Union 1707. And one that we have lots of rows about, the European Communities Act 1972, in a sense going back to the disputes about issues in 1688. The European Communities Act is the fundamental act that makes us part of the European Union, previously the EEC. And interestingly, there was a case, which for those who want to study this, it's 2002, EWHC 19195 in the Admin Court of Thoburn versus Sunderland City Council, which was an appeal by way of case stated, looking at what is and what is not constitutional law. And it concluded that, and it's paragraphs 56 and 57 if anyone wants to look at it, that implied repeal does not apply to constitutional law. I'm sort of assuming everybody knows about the concepts of parliamentary sovereignty and implied repeal. Should I go into that? Parliamentary sovereignty means a parliament cannot bind a later parliament. So basically parliament can keep on changing its mind. But implied repeal means if parliament passes a bill today that conflicts with the bill that was passed 20, 30, 100 years ago, that part of the bill it conflicts with is implied to have been repealed, even if it's not explicit. And this case was considered by the High Court in the Administrative Court. It was actually about metrication. And they concluded, and in the end of the day, how the judges interpret law is important, they concluded that we couldn't retrospectively repeal part of that particular act unless it was explicit. It had to be explicit, not implicit, because it's part of international treaty law. And obviously this country negotiates treaties of all sorts, with all sorts of people all the time. And, you know, if you watch all the paperwork going through Parliament, you see how many different deals are being done on this, that and the other. And when you have multi-partite agreements, it's very difficult to rescind them unilaterally, as Greeks decided to try to do recently and was found that they didn't quite like it when they tried to do that. So the European Communities Act is very much like that because it affects the interpretation of UK law. Human Rights Act 1998, again, it cannot change primary legislation, but it means that primary legislation is supposed to be interpreted in where it can be interpreted a number of ways, along with the European Convention of Human Rights. And that secondary legislation, and I'll come into the primary and secondary side of things at some stage, secondary legislation can be struck down by the courts if it's considered to be in conflict with the European Convention of Human Rights. All right? And this is where a lot of debates go on about all of these things, and we can, if you want me to talk about the Council of Europe rather than the European Council and the European Convention of Human Rights. Is that a question or just put your hand up? No, it's okay. Just do be careful, because if you're asked, I'm quite happy to be interrupted, it's not a problem. And actually, you see it in Parliament, people stand up to intervene on it. It actually makes for a much better debate, because as an issue crops up, you start looking at it all. So we have then, the Human Rights Act is important. Government of Wales Act and Scotland Act obviously very important because they enable different bodies to create laws. And one part of the Constitution people very often forget is the standing orders of the House of Commons, because they determine what can be done. We have this debate, which is called the West Lothian question, is that given we give Scotland and the Scots a load of money, more than people in England get per capita, and they can make their own laws, why should the Scottish MPs have the right to make decisions about English laws when the English MPs don't have the right to make decisions about Scottish laws? I'm sympathetic to that argument. I think that is clearly wrong. It's called the West Lothian question because Tam Dalyell, when he was MP for West Lothian, asked it. And there has been a debate about creating what's called a Grand Committee of only the English MPs to decide whether something should pass through Parliament. And that can be done all through standing orders of the House of Commons. And that actually is quite a big constitutional shift, to create two classes of members of Parliament. One class who can vote on English legislation, another class that can, well, more than two classes, because it would also be, you've got this complication that Wales has some powers but not other powers. And so you have different areas, and some laws cover the whole of the UK. And it's an interesting constitutional point that merely by changing the standing orders, you can actually create different types of MPs. doesn't require statute, which is to go through the House of Commons and the House of Lords and be signed by the monarch. Just a motion in the House of Commons can actually change that. And there is always one question, which is when should there be public assent to constitutional changes? We had it, obviously, in respect of Scotland having its parliament. We had it for Wales having a parliament. People decided not to have alternative vote through a referendum. And there is going to be a referendum on our continued membership of the European Union. Now, my argument on this is that actually our constitution was established by popular consent because we had a popular revolution. A non-violent revolution, but a revolution nonetheless, which established it, and therefore substantial changes to the constitution require popular consent. So I do think there is a role for referenda in the British Constitution for those reasons. So those are essentially what are considered to be constitutional laws. And the thing about Parliament is that one of the things about having a sort of constitution that's developed sort of on, as it goes really, is it gets really quite complicated. And a lot of people don't necessarily know how complicated it is because it isn't really effective, which is understandable. But I thought I'd give you some ideas of some of the more complicated bits to do it. Obviously, not least, for instance, that primary legislation, which cannot be challenged by the courts on any basis, can actually be changed by secondary legislation. And I think there are actually 14 ways of doing it, because although people talk about whether you can introduce it, first reading, second reading in the House of Commons, committee stage, report stage, third reading, goes to the House of Lords, it might play a bit of ping-pong to and fro. I can explain all of that if you want, and it goes off to the monarch to be signed if everyone can agree, subject to the Parliament Acts, of course. But in fact, the committee stage for bills from the Law Commission, which are about improving the quality of law, often, however contentious, can start in a committee. They don't actually have to start with the second reading on the floor of the House. They can start actually with the second reading in the committee. And there is a Regulatory Reform Select Committee, which is enabled to change primary legislation through statutory instrument, which is where an ordering council, the Privy Council, is issued to Parliament. It's an interesting thing. I was on that committee as well as on the Procedure Select Committee, and I was also on the Joint Committee on the vires of statutory instruments, which has interesting debates about whether or not you should have the word will or shall in statutory instruments. But, the point about statutory instruments is that law is what is enforceable, and what is enforceable by the courts. Judicial review is a good way of looking at that. You can have a judicial review where the courts will enforce the law on the basis of legitimate expectation through just a policy issue. You can have an enforceable part of law, so that's not even with it going anywhere close to Parliament. The statutory guidance where Parliament gives a minister a power to produce guidance can be enforced in the law, in the courts, even though it hasn't been through Parliament. That's sort of like tertiary legislation, really. And then secondary legislation is what I call there are different types of secondary legislation. No sense, questions and I'll answer it, but I don't think it really helps to deal with that. And then primary legislation goes through both houses of Parliament and goes on from there. But there are interesting also other places, the ways which you can pass legislation other than through the Parliament. And interestingly, the English Parliament was from 1267 to 1706, which included Wales. Scottish Parliament was from 1424 to 1707, so you have a different, because we had what's called a personal union, where you have the same monarch, but actually a different parliament until the Darien scheme went a bit haywire in Central America. And then the Parliament of Great Britain was an interesting one, England, Wales and Scotland, but not Ireland, and then the Irish Parliament from 1495 to 1800, and then the UK Parliament. But also other bodies, apart from the more recent Northern Ireland Assembly, National Assembly for Wales, Scottish Parliament, the Church of England, under the Church of England Assembly Powers Act 1919, the Church Assembly, which is now the Synod, has lawmaking powers, which is interesting. There are different types of statutory instruments. And then, of course, we have, because all of these different bodies have their secondary legislative powers as well. So we also have bylaws that the local authority can apply for a bylaw to have laws that are enforceable in the parts. In Birmingham, it's the council that does that. So that's all an interesting run around with the different aspects of how the Constitution operates.
My question is, I want to know, but I don't know much, because as a human, in this country used to be a Catholic one time, and Henry decided to bring Church of England, and when the equality came into as a religion where you can equal amongst ourselves, you respect other religions, when he gave that Parliament gave the right, because a lot of Catholics those days was a chase, whatever the practice, secret, whatever his religion. I mean, they were trying to blow the Parliament one time, and he paid the price. Yeah. So I just want to light on that.
Well, this obviously out on the way to Kidderminster is one of the places where the Birmingham Catholic Church own that. And if you haven't heard the words in the Bill of Rights 1688, I actually have the text here, and I'm quite happy to give this paperwork to anyone who wants it. Most of it's just off the internet, and you can get it very easily. But the Bill of Rights was very much an anti-Catholic thing, and the Bill of Rights was one of these pieces of legislation that says at the end of it, we can't change this, which we've now changed in lots of ways. But it had effects of banning Catholics from all sorts of things, and also banning Catholics from being... You can understand the difficulties of having a Catholic as head of the Church of England. And if you're interested in studying this further, you should look at the speeches of Jacob Rees-Mogg, who is a Catholic, in this Parliament, when we were looking at the issue as to the succession, to enable women to succeed to the throne in the same way as men can succeed to the throne. But whether you need me to read out everything from it, but it's all here. But basically what happened was there was a massive row which resulted in William and Mary being brought in to run the country. And it was really a religious dispute in many ways. It has its similarities, of course, to this question of a power outside the UK having influence within the UK. Because if you go back to the original Magna Carta, that was got rid of at the instructions of the Pope. So you can understand those tensions developing there in the political sense, because obviously religion was a lot more political than it is today. Well, you can argue about how political religion is today, but it was very, very political when you go back. And obviously you have a partial theocracy in the sense that we have a small number of people who are in the House of Lords on the basis of their religious position. They're very partial, they're not very massively influential, but they are there on the basis of their religious position. But the Bill of Rights is a really very religiously biased document. And what happened was gradually over a period of time, those tensions, even if you go back to the Secret Ballot Act in 1870, there were certain religious tensions in all of that as well. And we go back to these questions of, and I do have it in here, when they brought in a limit on how wealthy people had to be able to vote in the elections. Because there's some interesting changes have gone on over time. Like we talk about an MP being the youngest MP at the age of 20 because the age was reduced from 21 to 18. In fact, going back way back when there was a teenager in Parliament for for political reasons at the time. But what we had is 1429. The statute said to vote in a county election you had to have freehold property worth 40 shillings a year. Now, I don't know what 40 shillings a year was worth now in today's money for 1429. The tension around bringing in a wider franchise was why they introduced the idea of spiritual undue influence in election law in the 1800s, because they were worried that people, as the franchise was expanded, they were worried about religious influence, people being instructed on which way to vote. So that's where all of that came from. But again, I see gradually things are moving more and more towards controlling power, but in some senses they're also moving away from it. And one of the good things about the last Parliament is that the executive wasn't in tight control. That is, things could go wrong for the government. And it's much harder now, one political party having overall control. And I've always personally taken the view that it would be better to have an election system where people more closely represent the electorate, rather than one that delivers what we've got. 36.9% of those who voted for the Conservatives, and they have a working majority. Back in 2005, 35.2% of people voted for Tony Blair, and he had a working majority. And the danger in all of that is actually that because the government don't have to worry too much about Parliament, they don't have to argue for their policies, they don't have to tack, they don't have to change, they just can ram everything through Parliament. And there are difficulties, I understand some of the difficulties, which if you look at the way what actually happens at the moment with legislation, primary legislation particularly, is Parliament doesn't write it. People say Parliament writes legislation. It doesn't. Legislation is written in Whitehall, and Parliament assents to it. And there is a difficulty, which is a very simple difficulty. If you're going to write good legislation, you need to consult people. And at an absolute minimum, you need to at least see what all the departments of government think. Because something which is good for, within the context, say, of agriculture, maybe something that really hits the Treasury hard and Justice hard, or something else like that. So, as an absolute minimum, you need to see what feedback comes from the different departments of government. And so, when a bill's in committee, the bill's just basically forced through the committee by the whips. What should be possible is for any ideas and challenges to be then considered, and the consultation go on, and the wider consultation with people more generally. So what actually happened in the last Parliament, if you watched it happening, if there was a good idea that cropped up in the Bill Committee, in the House of Commons, the consultations took so long that the bill wasn't changed until it got into the House of Lords. Right? Now, I don't know for certain, but my expectation is in this Parliament, actually, it'll just get rammed through, because the government has a tight control over the majority in the House of Commons. Things we were doing to strengthen Parliament were things like having more opportunities to vote on bills in the detail, not just shall we have the whole bill or not, but amendments at report stage. We were trying to do that. I don't think we'll see any more progress on that at all. And that's important, because unless each individual MP has a vote on little bits of the bill, it's all lumped together in the third reading, and so people don't really rebel, because they can't just take one clause out. They have to accept the whole thing or not. And because it's manoeuvred such that there isn't a vote on the individual bits where everybody's there, effectively you can't challenge the system, because you can't get that. Now, we looked at that. Private members' bills are mainly a farce, because they, again, unless they're written by the government, you'll see of private members' bills that go through, the vast majority of them are what's called handout bills. That is, they've been drafted by the government, and the government wants them on the statute book, but hasn't got the parliamentary time to get them on the statute book, so it persuades somebody who's won the ballot, would you like to have a law on the statute book? And a lot of people will say, yes, I'd like a law on the statute book. Well, what is it I have to put on? And then that's put on the statute book. And it's not very clever. So there's a long way to go, and I do think there is a role for making it clearer what threshold is needed before you have popular assent for change to the constitution. Because we've got some of that on the EU now, where if we hand any more powers to the EU, there is automatically a referendum. But obviously that can be repealed by any subsequent parliament. And there needs to be a protection for people more generally. There's some popular control on the political process if larger changes are proposed. And I personally still think that we need to modify the electoral system to... Yeah?
I'm just wondering, I'm learning a lot about the complexities, as you described them, in Parliament. And I'm wondering if this isn't another, even if it be subliminal, reason for so few actually bothering to vote. The whole thing's so complicated. The chances of your MP actually having any real influence is so slight. Well, why bother? Maybe.
Yeah, it is difficult. I think one of the
difference, of course, of it is fiddling the expenses.
Yeah. There are two issues. One is what I call the Westminster bubble problem, which is you have the politicians and the media going off on one, but often that isn't actually directly connected with what's actually going on. So you have the Westminster bubble discussing various things, but some of the facts are basically wrong. And so that's a difficulty. MPs do have quite a bit of influence as individuals. They have more influence collectively. And things, in the last parliament, in the previous parliament, one or two things were changed by rebellion, etc. In the last parliament, quite a few things were changed by rebellion. And there is a lot that an individual MP can do. There is another issue of social capital, which is that as social capital goes down, social capital is what was in, I think, Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone. He looked at people's willingness to do things which are voluntary activity. And he described that as social capital and measured it, interestingly, on how much people trust strangers. Which is an interesting thought. The question that in a society with greater social capital, you don't have to protect your back so much because people aren't out to fiddle you so much. And if you look around the world, some countries have a lot less social capital than others. The culture has a lot less. And there's more corruption and things like that. And therefore, people have to spend more time in protecting their interests than in trying to do the best they can in any given circumstance, if you see what I mean. I will come to that, and don't worry, I'm not avoiding any questions. I'd just like to finish on this. And the argument is that social capital has gone down. People's willingness to do voluntary things has gone down. I also worry that the lack of... Here we have a meeting, a good number of people have turned up, but it's not masses of people. Constitutional issues tend to be really big issues. And yes, at times people don't turn up to public meetings unless they're protesting about something that's going to happen, rather than anything else. But the willingness of people to do voluntary things has gone down. That is partly seen in people not turning up at meetings. Partly the television is all one way. You cannot heckle. I'm going to take another question in a second. You can heckle the telly if you want, but the person being heckled doesn't know. And that's a danger, because if you're in a public meeting and everyone goes, ooh, you know that something you said isn't that popular, and you know there's an issue there. And actually, even standing here, I can see some people nod. Nobody's thrown anything at me as yet. I'm hoping I won't have to duck any shoes or anything else like that. But the point is that you don't have that with the way politics is represented. Also, there's a great danger, which is that on a television programme, they're after change. A very short presentation. No real attempts to explain the issues behind it. When I try to, sometimes, I don't know if you've noticed, I do try sometimes, even when I'm on the telly, to try and explain the issues. But I'm often shut up. And that's no good, because then you never get anywhere. Anyways, I did notice you wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, it was only actually if you could give examples at both ends of the spectrum about the social capital thing, countries which are...
Well, Somalia. Alright? Somalia is pretty disorderly, isn't it? You're going to have some difficulties successfully running a music business in Somalia. Let's put it that way, right? Somalia is a good example of one extreme Sweden, the Nordic countries are the other example. In a sense, when you look at the index of corruption, that's quite useful, because if you've got a country where you're having to slip money to people, you're not necessarily able to be as efficient as you could be, because you're having to slip the odd fiver and tenner and £100.
Romania is an example.
Romania is not as bad as Somalia.
You can't get anything done in Romania.
Yeah, but Romania again is not as bad as Somalia. And the point about that is that a lot of energy goes into the corrupt processes. And one of the things, to be fair to the EU, is trying to get rid of those sorts of corrupt practices. If you look at when Croatia became a member of the EU, certain changes were requested from the judicial system, because there are dangers. We have problems in this country with some aspects of the judicial system. Not you know, people know I campaign about the family courts because I deal with people who leave this country to escape the system. So you know all about that, probably, or some of you will know about that. But because they find in other countries, if they go to other countries, they get left alone. Here they get harassed, and it's a very strange system. Again, I can talk about that later if you want. But yeah, Somalia, Romania is a good example. The other end of it, the Nordic countries, very good examples of those. And it does affect the economy more generally, because that money which is being siphoned off is not good for people's quality of life.
Can I ask you about the United Nations and how the Magna Carta relates to it really?
Well, see, I see it as all part of trying to strengthen the rule of law in many ways, which is you're trying to have things developed so that it's not about might is right. It's about, you know, much that one can be critical about the UN in lots of aspects. The primary objective has to be to avoid war, I would say. It sounds reasonable.
Yes.
And therefore, having a Security Council where you've got to line up various people, and you know, you may disagree with me about I'm not that stressed about the vetoes in the Security Council, because effectively what they do is they give the Russians the ability to negotiate with people rather than get so upset that they fund, you know, obviously you look at the Ukrainian situation, that's not good. But in many ways you're trying to avoid war, you're trying to avoid people's deaths by having a process of discussion, even if it's flawed, if you see what I mean. So I wouldn't say, you know, to what extent Magna Carta is about trying to control power. The UN actually is about trying to control power.
Yes.
All systems have their problems. I was one of the rebels on the Syria issue. I didn't when it came. This is the Syria chemical weapons issue. My argument was that if we're going to strengthen international law, we need to try out the UN in controlling chemical weapons, which in the Syrian environment has worked. Even though there are lots of other problems in Iraq and Syria, I don't deny all of that. But in terms of actually, if you don't try to make the international bodies, the argument was being put that the international bodies won't be able to do it, so we can't rely on them. And I argued a different argument, which is if you never try them out, they'll never succeed. And it is, again, it's a gradual process. Obviously, if you look at the International Criminal Court, which in a sense is part of all of these bodies, because although it's, I don't know, it links into the UN in some way or other, and it's part of the UN. So, well, obviously, the point about the International Criminal Court is the Security Council can refer something to it. And I do think it has had some positive effects. I do think it has sort of reduced the use of child soldiers, for instance. That has worked quite well. So, again, what is the International Criminal Court? Well, it's actually trying to avoid sovereign immunity. The idea that the sovereign, whoever the sovereign may be, and you know, talking about North Korea, it's the Kim Jong whatever family. Is he Un or ill at the moment? I don't know, whichever Kim Jong he is. Ill for the moment. It's Un, and then it was all whichever that family. You know, rather, I think they are particularly one for the divine ruler type, sort of cult of the personality type arrangement. So trying to say, well, actually, you can't escape that just by putting a load of money in Switzerland and expecting to retire and get your number Swiss bank account. Actually, you will be held to account if you're an appalling political leader. And it's that accountability. You look at interesting questions in Greece at the moment about Varoufakis and the 3 attempts to prosecute him over his handling of the Greek economy for the first 5 months of the Syriza government that have been tabled by the Supreme Court with the Parliament there. I don't know the merits of their arguments, but it's an interesting question about accountability.
Thank you. Any more questions? Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. In King John's time, about 800 years ago, there was a lot of warfare between France and England, and I gather that King John, leaving the country at the time, lost a lot of territory, Normandy and so on, to France.
Yeah.
Is there any section of, as far as you know, of Magna Carta that deals with warfare and how to...
Well, the Magna Carta as it now is in force has 3 clauses.
Sorry?
The Magna Carta that we have in law at the moment is the Magna Carta 1297. It has 3 clauses, and I read them out.
Mm-hmm.
All right? So, as we are now, no. If you don't mind me, I don't claim... Do you remember, I don't know, when I was asked to speak about it, I wanted to speak more widely about the British Constitution and its relevance to Magna Carta. And really it's about how to control power. If you go back in the history, a lot of the issues about raising taxation were, which gave the power to the Parliament, because they said you can't, unless we get these powers, you can't have the money, arose from like wars in Sicily and all sorts of things, and very strange international political situations. But Magna Carta, as Magna Carta now is, has nothing in it about war at all. As it now is. I'm not saying that it never has done.
In terms of controlling power, I mean, presumably proportional representation would be a way of controlling power.
Yeah. Well, STV or whatever.
Then you could argue you'd never get anything done or decided.
Well, there's an interesting... the first thing is this. Obviously, you know, Ireland, Australia does reasonably well. They use STV. Germany has had the additional member system. Single transferable vote, STV, is a system of proportional representation where each constituency has a number of representatives, and it's the same as they use for Scottish local elections and for Northern Irish local elections. Ireland uses it, and Australia uses it. Germany uses an additional member system. I wouldn't argue myself. The additional member system is you elect a number of people in constituencies, and then based on the proportion of votes everyone got, if a party got 5% of the votes, it gets a number of members of parliament to go with it. I personally wouldn't say Germany has failed as a consequence of its electoral system. I wouldn't say Australia has failed as a consequence of its electoral system. If you look around the world, you can find unstable governments, you can find stable governments. Is it right to have something which delivers for about a third of the people voting, maybe a fifth of the people who are on the electoral roll? So you have this government, the elective dictatorship, as it's called, Hailsham's phrase, on the basis of a fifth of the people. In itself, obviously, if somebody's in the safe, I think it was your point about people's willingness to vote. If you're in a safe seat, the enthusiasm for voting sometimes is lower because they know it's always going to go that way. The marginality is not there. If you have STV, everybody's votes count. So the chances of your vote influencing the result is much greater. So I don't think the case is well argued that a proportional representation of some form in itself produces unstable governments. There have been unstable governments, but I don't think it's necessarily just...
It would seem fairer, wouldn't it, given the millions of votes the Greens got and UKIP?
Yeah. They only get one seat each, yeah, exactly. Fair, but it's about controlling the executive. Remembering that a lot of what the government does is not in anyone's manifesto, because it's about handling the business of government on a day-to-day basis. And it always will be that way, because the civil service, what is again ignored, apart from in Westminster, which is actually a very good programme, but what the civil service and their relationship with the politicians is always ignored in the public debate, But actually it's very important because ideas crop up in the civil service. And people sometimes say, "There's no bother, I don't bother voting because the government always gets in." And I can understand that because at times the ideas come from the civil service and aren't held back by the political establishment. But on the other hand, that may be that the ideas, it may be the ideas are good, it may be the ideas at times are bad. And it depends on different policy subjects. But I worry that by not having that debate, because things just get rammed through without really people being persuaded, everyone loses interest. Because the Newsnight, you might as well not bother watching it because so much of it is disconnected to reality. And
I still watch it.
yeah, well, I don't. Because I know, but the thing is, when you actually know what's going on, it's much more irritating.
Well, it's always a difficult decision between Newsnight and Question Time.
Yeah. Yeah, but the danger with both of those is they have that same difficulty of the rapid change. I've done interviews for Newsnight, and they focus so much time on the quality of the picture. And they do really arty pictures. Now, I don't deny that the arty pictures are really nice things. And, you know, being filmed using a camera 20 yards away because it gives a better background is good. But actually, what we need is a little bit of time explaining to people what's going on. Because people are not, you know, the old BBC idea of informing people isn't really there. It's more of entertainment.
Oh, well, you know, I agree. I think Newsnight is...
Well, I could do a critique of any particular one if you want.
Oh, Jeremy Paxton's interview.
You
would ask me the same question.
He asked the same question of Michael Howard sort of so many times, and in retrospect, the answer Michael Howard gave was accurate.
Yeah, that's it.
So it created great entertainment.
Yeah.
And I
think Evan Davies listens more than Paxman did.
I don't know. To be honest, I gave up listening to most of these things some years ago.
I'm surprised I thought it would be.
No, because it's irritating when you think, well, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. And what you find, and I found this on the receiving end of it, is that the journalists have decided what the story is, and they try to fit what you're saying to the story. And if you don't fit, they don't put you on. Or they skewed me down on Newsnight once to six words, because I was trying to explain, actually, it's a bit more complicated than that. And the problem with that is actually, I think people do want to know.
Yes.
You know, my view is, I've always found that people are quite interested in politics, because politics affects everyone on a day-to-day basis.
The lunchtime on Daily Politics...
That's a bit better, actually. Yeah, no, Daily Politics, to be fair, Andrew Neil and his team do impress me from time to time. Yeah.
Well, he has good credentials, doesn't he? Editor of the Sunday Times.
Oh, I know.
When they were doing most of the investigative stuff.
No, sorry. Well, he has, and they do manage on some of the issues. They have done things which are actually insightful, which I haven't found with Newsnight. Newsnight, you get this sort of attempt to set the news agenda, and the biggest political stories are about people. It's who's in power, who's likely to be out of power.
The other thing to do is to read The Guardian.
That irritates me.
I think that's the most intelligent newspaper.
Well, I'm sorry, I gave up The Guardian years ago. But again, it's when you start getting into the depths of an issue, and you get the debates about austerity are a good example of that. And the difficulty is that you have to really get into the depths of the issue about economic multipliers and, well, actually, what is the government doing? People say there's a debate behind people with a Keynesian perspective and those who are not. Actually, no, there isn't. The government has accepted that government spending increases economic activity, and that's why it's only gradually reducing spending rather than otherwise. And those debates don't go anywhere. Nobody tries to look at, well, what actually is the economic multiplier in your formula, and how do you work that one out? And this drives everything else, because it is, in a sense, the question of how you handle government finance that underpins a lot of the national debate at the moment. And it'd be nice to go into some detail sometime.
Well, Evan Davies used to be excellent at explaining that sort of stuff, very simply. But in some ways, it's a pity he lost the finance focus.
I gave up with it years ago. So
Can I ask about the Syrian vote compared with the protest on Iraq in 2003?
Well, I wasn't in Parliament. I was on the protest in 2003.
Yeah, when you see that, surely the MPs realise the strength of feeling against going into Iraq, as they did in Syria, the Syrian situation, and they voted not to go into Syria. Now, why didn't the government in 2003 listen, or the MPs, in the same way in 2003 as they then did in the Syria situation?
Speaking as somebody who went on the demonstration in London, I think the difficulty actually was that the public opinion itself, most of some people like myself were protesting about it, public opinion more widely was more ambivalent. And that's where your difficulty lies. And again, it comes down to a failing of Parliament to get to the truth. Because one of my successes in Parliament was to get in a set of rules so that if somebody doesn't answer a written parliamentary question, if the minister doesn't answer a written parliamentary question, you can complain to the Procedure Select Committee. Prior to that, what often used to happen is if an MP didn't get a proper written answer, they'd use freedom of information. Because freedom of information is actually more powerful in operation than the written parliamentary questions. And obviously, if you're there to hold the government to account is explaining getting the facts right. And I think one of the difficulties going back to 2003 is the arguments about the truth of the 45 minutes and all that sort of stuff were not properly had. In many ways, the government very often in this country is an inquiry trying to study how to avoid a car crash by looking at the rearview mirror about 2 years ago. And we're not really necessarily trying to get into great detail as to what the facts are now. We have an inquiry, check Chilcot. Well, Chilcot, it's when did Chilcot start? About 2009, was it, something like that? And it's still. I can understand the argument on what's called maximalisation, but we're not getting. Somebody had a very good joke about it. We can go 9 billion miles to Pluto and take pictures from 7,000 miles above Pluto, but we can't go 5 miles across London to print the Chilcot report. I thought that was quite a good joke. Wasn't my joke though, for copyright reasons, but I can't remember who to attribute it to, so I don't think you'd probably retweet it on Twitter if somebody complains about copyright. That I think was a success. Not that everybody noticed it because people were writing. There was a book written by various MPs, including me, about parliamentary reform. Some said we should have a process for dealing with the failure to answer written questions. And I said at the launch meeting, if you'd read the book, you'd know there is a process, which is, in a sense, one of the difficulties with an unwritten constitution is people don't know what to do. They don't know who to ask how to do something. That's actually a lot of how do you do it questions are difficult to come by. The example I gave earlier is a good example of a legal question which is complex because it's an appeal by way of case stated, and those are very rare. Because they come from the magistrate's court. If you want me to talk more about that, I'm happy to. But things are quite complicated in this country, and finding somebody who knows how it works isn't that easy, which is a challenge as well.
I suppose the temptation for us, really, hearing you speak fluently on the complexities, is that, can't be bothered, leave it to us.
Well, that's called representative democracy, isn't it?
But it's sad, isn't it? It's sad that we haven't got a grip on. But
people can. If the media tried more, particularly the television, I'm critical of. The newspapers, again, you've got a difficulty with newspapers. They have to write so many column inches. There are fewer journalists to do it. There's not so much money around. It's a harder job. But if there was a greater attempt not to do 5 or 6 issues, but to do one issue and try and go into a little bit of depth and try and find out what are the issues that divide people. Why is it one of my great? I like Jacob Rees-Mogg, although we don't agree politically on things necessarily, because he tries to find out why people disagree. Because it's often, if you're trying to get into an argument, is what is the disagreement? Are your objectives different? Is your debate about practicalities different? Is your understanding of the model of reality different? Whatever it may be. He, like I, tried to get into those arguments.
I like his style.
Yeah, it's very good.
His dad was a bright bloke.
Yeah, no, I've got time for a guy to sit on the Joint Committee on the Vires of Statutory Instruments.
Yeah, I got a book by his dad on the day of reckoning or something. He reckoned there was going to be a big financial crash in the 90s, but
it happened a bit later.
It came a bit later.
But that we could talk about that one, sort of.
What I want to know is, we have referendum, we're going to have a referendum on Europe, but we never get a referendum on whether we should go to war or not, and the government are just about to vote to do drones on Syria, and a lot of people like me disagree with that. There's nothing you can do about it.
Well, this is the question I raised earlier about the threshold at which you have a referendum, and actually it's generally been constitutional issues, generally hasn't been policy issues. So I don't. If you don't mind me saying this, I don't think you will get a position where the government will agree to have a referendum on such decisions.
Well, I mean, they're very important decisions.
They're not only important decisions, but they're not constitutional. Yeah, they're not constitutional decisions.
The best we can do is write to our MPs.
Yeah, you should write. This is representative democracy. Yeah. But as I said, where I think the system fails is that Parliament itself doesn't get to the truth adequately. So often it doesn't assert itself. Right? So Parliament doesn't get to the truth. And even though Parliament is well reported, people more generally don't get to the truth. So it's the civil service gets away with things not being accurate because people can't challenge it. And that I think results in bad government. Yes. Bad decisions are taken which have long-term effects. Like Iraq, in many ways, Daesh, whatever you want to call them, are a consequence of the way in which Iraq was dealt with in 2003. If for instance, the Shia in the south had been allowed to take control of the south in the same way as the Kurds took control of the north, Saddam Hussein would have gone away without all the bloodshed and without all the disorder. But oddly enough, the State Department didn't like the idea that the Shia who looked towards Iran would give greater Iranian influence over Iraq. And so they didn't want that to happen. So what did they get? They got massive turmoil, Daesh, and they got Shia influence from Iran in southern Iraq and generally about Iraq, so they achieved nothing out of it. And that was part of, if you go back to the issues and stuff, because one of the questions about Iraq is, Tony Blair said, well, we either left Saddam Hussein or we didn't. Well, actually, that's not necessarily true, because the Shia were perfectly capable of taking control of southern Iraq, had the rules of engagement in southern Iraq for the southern no-fly zone being the same as the northern no-fly zone, but they weren't. And the State Department didn't like that. And that debate, that shows you an example of where a debate never happened. Because the debate was do one thing or do another, not do one thing, another, or a third thing, or not do a third thing. And that is the real danger of not having well-informed debates. The number of options gets limited to 2 when it's actually 5 or 6.
Can I make a point about referendums, which I'm sure most people are aware of already, and that is that when a referendum is held, it's not automatic that the result will be binding for the change that people might be voting to say they want.
It depends on the statute. Obviously, another interesting thing about the referendum we had in Birmingham on a elected mayor, which is that 5,000 people wrote no on the ballot paper. And their votes were not counted. But those people who wrote yes on the ballot paper, their votes were counted. Which is an interesting one. But it really does depend. And obviously, even in countries which have a constitutional binding requirement for referenda to pass, like Ireland on the Lisbon Treaty, can be asked to vote again until they get it right. Which is essentially what happened.
Because I was thinking on the line of obviously the Scottish referendum of independence, but also the one in Greece where the referendum result was that they didn't want greater austerity.
Yeah, but the thing is that the Germans, Finns, Slovaks, Bulgarians, everyone didn't want to give the Greeks any more money. So it doesn't matter how many referenda the Greeks saying give us some money, they're not going to get it. Right? Because basically, in practice, there were three countries who were sympathetic to Greece's position, which was Italy, France, and unsurprisingly Greek Cyprus. And all the other European countries, if they had referenda on the question of shall we give the Greeks some money, they're giving the Greeks some money anyway, but shall we give the Greeks some money on the conditions the Greeks wanted, would have said no. But there weren't referenda there. So, democracy cannot overcome reality. There was, I think, in the Illinois State House of Representatives in the late 1800s, there was a bill passed to change the value of pi from roughly 3.159793233846 to 3.2. Obviously, pi is a rational number where the number of decimal places goes sort of, infinitely. And they passed a bill to square the circle and change pi to 3.2. Passing a bill to change the value of pi does not change the value of pi. Even if it's a democratic vote passed unanimously.
But likewise, I'm saying, if there was a referendum on exiting Europe, and the British public voted to leave Europe, it's not guaranteed that the government would do that.
Well, if the vote, it's unlikely they wouldn't. But this is where you get these questions of Europe. What is Europe? Well, there are lots of different. Let me talk a little bit about Europe. You've got the EU, all right? We also have the EEA, the European Economic Area, and that is the EU plus Liechtenstein, Norway, and Iceland. Now, they have very similar rules, but they don't have the common agricultural policy or common fisheries policy, but the rest are the same. And Norway pays a lot of money to the EU for access to the common market, as it is. So, the UKIP used to say in their manifesto that what they think we should do is leave the EU and be in the EEA. And yet the arguments are questions as to whether freedom of movement operates properly. And actually the EEA has the same freedom of movement because most of the laws apply to the EEA as much as the EU. And so you end up in this question of if we actually ended up in the EEA as opposed to the EU, is that what people would expect from the debate? Now, here's an example of something where this is probably not debated. When it comes up on a television programme, people don't probably talk about. They might talk about human rights, and we can have a long argument about the European Convention of Human Rights. But actually, that's the Council of Europe, not the European Council. And the Council of Europe is the EU, the EEA, and pretty well everybody else, including Russia. All right. So it's a completely different body.
Nobody's ever told us that, though.
Well, this is one of the difficulties. As I said. One of the reasons I get a bit tired of watching programmes like Newsnight is they don't tell you some of the really basic facts about the Council of Europe. I have assisted people to take cases to the Council of Europe, to the European Court of Human Rights. The European Court of Human Rights is managed by the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe deals with what are essentially multilateral treaties, which is to make sure that phone connections work and things like that, where it's really very technical issues. Can be substantially political at times, but it's not the really sensitive issues about some of the free trade issues. And people don't get told that actually, regardless of your arguments about how the European Court of Human Rights works and how the Human Rights Acts work, in fact it's nothing to do with the EU. That aspect is nothing to do with the EU. Except for the fact the European Court of Justice is also potentially looking at human rights issues, but theoretically we're not part of that anyway. So you end up with these really frenzied debates which are not properly informed. The debate about when family life should affect whether somebody is deported, does having a cat mean that you shouldn't be deported? Which has been part of a case. Is not a debate about the EU, it's not a debate about the EEA, and it's a completely separate thing. But will you ever see that on the telly? Probably not, because were I to try to explain it, I would get shut up. Not because they don't want people to know, but they don't want me to talk for such a long time as I actually explain how it works.
This is why the people people just do not know enough about the
They don't.
European Union.
No, exactly. Well, all of these different bodies and how they work. And they argue, for instance, about the EU getting involved in the shapes of bananas. Well, actually, if you're going to have a common market, you need to decide what's an acceptable banana. So, if you're going to have any argument about where it should get involved and where it shouldn't get involved, trade rules have to be right. And we have the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership arguments. And TTIP is sort of, and the World Trade Organization, is another way of looking at trade issues. Now, I personally don't think it'll ever happen. The European Parliament voted recently to introduce an open court system rather than ISDS, which I think is quite important. But there you have another thing going on, where the debate probably doesn't focus sufficiently on the very important issues of detail that it should focus on. And that again, is a problem. And that's why public meetings are a good way of doing it. Questions from an audience, not questions from the presenter, but questions from an audience who'd like to know answers to questions that they personally are interested in. That's a good thing. And I was happy with that as a process. But you can see where my frustration comes from. That some of the things that I say, you can get it off the internet, it's not difficult. But you don't get it off the telly.
Not yes. How these things you're saying? I mean, you've been MP and a lot of people, you've been on committee. It's easier to say there's so much things that in our country is wrong. As an individual, how can we make that positive, different?
Well, you've got to decide what you want to change, and obviously some of
just talk
I tell you, one of the you come back to this point, as I said, that it doesn't matter who you vote for, the government gets in. Some things are difficult to deal with. So austerity is not nice. Making cuts is not nice. Nobody should like making cuts. But if you just say no cuts, you can't win the argument, because basically some money's got to come from somewhere. We can talk about sovereign debt, interest rates, all that sort of jazz. And explain why the regulatory problems caused the financial crisis, but we're still stuck where we are, where we've got to somehow make the books balance. That's one of the difficulties. And they get issues, I get stressed about certain things which are to do with expert evidence in family courts and things like that, which is why I end up dealing with people. I've got a couple of people in France. The previous interview I did was actually with two pregnant ladies in France who'd gone to France because if they stayed here, their babies would be taken at birth. All right? Whereas in France, the authorities are quite happy to just send them home with the baby, because the French authorities assess things a different way to the English authorities. Now that's a much different political argument to one about let's have some more money, if you see what I mean, because it's actually about decision making, the use of power, that sort of thing. I'm hoping tomorrow night, if I can get it organised, to do a panel interview on the internet involving somebody from Sweden, somebody from the Slovak Republic, and actually a French journalist who lives in Cambridge but from France, also about these issues. So there's a lot of political issues that don't involve money, but there are also political issues which are about resources and things like that. You can, if there's an area that's being ignored, you can get some attention on it. Writing to an MP can have quite a bit of an impact at times. There's a process, because the MP writes to the minister and that feeds into the system. So it's a worthwhile process.
I do find that Giesler is a good listener and takes action.
Giesler is good because she's independently minded. She does think for herself.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
I've got a lot of time for Giesler. Yeah. But she thinks for herself and does things, she doesn't just go down with the party line all the time. So I've got a lot of time for her in that sense.
The Labour, please.
Sorry?
In Birmingham, I like that. The one for this area, I think it's very good too. Got to.
Well, we can argue. We can argue about people. I'm not going to go into who are the better MPs, who are the worst ones, apart from positive comments about me.
My question, when you talked about the European Parliament, when you go from here, Dover to Calais, it's only water you see is blue. This just nothing else you see. As in this country, when we elected whoever the majority of the parliament is at the moment is conservative, when they go and sit in the European Parliament, they're not like out of this planet. They are like somewhere else. Most of the Europeans interact with each other, and their program on European, they show it in every country. They have a flag for it. They show it every day in the
European Parliament. Well, you can,
what do we know about European Parliament in this country?
You can actually get at it.
Yeah. But through the internet.
You get it on the internet.
Yeah, but that's internet. But you know what?
That is a decision by the media, isn't it?
Well, we have a Parliament channel.
Yeah.
There's a lot on it.
Well, the Parliament channel, to be fair, really does focus on the green benches.
Yeah, yeah.
And then puts a little bit on, and then it does other things as well. If you want to find out what's happening in the European Parliament, to the great extent, you have to go on the internet. I would say, you see, the recent vote of the European Parliament to say that we shouldn't have the ISDS secret courts arbitration system for TTIP, if we have TTIP, I think that was a very important issue. Didn't get any real attention here. We got a little bit reported ex post facto, but not in advance. And I think that was a mistake, an editorial mistake by the media. But, you know, as you know, I'm not that great a fan of how the BBC particularly handle politics. And they do most of the political stuff, because, you know, the other channels have much less political stuff on it. But even they do it very well.
News is pretty good.
Well, yeah. I use the internet to get my information.
John, just out of curiosity, I mean, you've obviously got a grasp of all this legal stuff and so on. Are you professionally a lawyer? Is that your...
My degree is in physics, specialising in atomic computing and theoretical physics. And I first founded my business in 1983, which now employs 250 people, with a turnover of about 20 million, which is in the computer business and the finance business. So it's sort of, I do a certain amount of legal stuff, but I'm not in any way qualified.
You're not a barrister? No.
I'm not a barrister. No. I did look at it once, but my business picked up too much, and I thought, no, I'll leave that.
It's only the Tony Blair. That's barrister.
Whether he's a good barrister is another question.
His wife's a better barrister.
Yeah.
Okay. But nothing stick on him, you see.
There are a lot of lawyers in Parliament, but then that's not too surprising. But I was one of the few people with a physics degree.
Anyway, I think on that note, John, we've had such a long talk and excellent in every way, and thank you for all the audience participation as well. It's been really good.
Well, it's the better part of this discussion.
Yes,
really.
it is, isn't it? So I'd like to thank you very much indeed.
Right. Very happy to come along.
Okay. Now there's tea and coffee just round the corner, just to help ourselves, and there's some information, New World, etc. about the UNA. So that's it. And there's also going to be a silk collection for use of the room.